So, hello everyone. Let's get started. Thanks for coming to this epidemiology seminar. You did the right thing. We're having a very exciting talk ahead of us. First, to introduce myself, I'm Stefan Erhardt. I am an associate professor in the Department of Epidemiology and in the Center for Clinical Trials. Today we are having our Center for Clinical Trials and GTPCI visiting scholar with us, Dr. Robert Califf. Robert is Vice Chancellor of Clinical and Translational Research and Professor of Medicine in the Division of Cardiology at Duke University Medical Center. He has led numerous landmark clinical trials and is really a leader in the field of cardiovascular medicine, of health outcomes and quality of care. He's also well known and very active in global collaborations in cardiovascular medicine, in the place of academia, in clinical trial design, conduct, analysis, and reporting, in bioinformatics, and in community engagement in clinical trials. He likes to cross the artificial barriers between the fields of medicine. For example, when he works on the effect of depression on outcomes in cardiac patients. And so overall, he is one significant voice to be heard in the field of cardiovascular medicine, in the field of trials, and in the efficient translation of research results into healthcare. So please join me in welcoming Rob Califf to Johns Hopkins and particularly to the Bloomberg School of Public Health.
Well, thanks for that very nice introduction. And it has been great to be here, although I got to say I'm completely exhausted. This has been quite an amazing sort of cornucopia of different kinds of research being done here, and it's been a lot of fun to talk to the people who are really doing it and learn from it, try to make some comments, and hopefully the learning has been mutual. I'm going to talk today about something that really got started for me when I read an article by Kay Dickerson in Lancet. Having done a lot of collaborative clinical trials with a guy named John Symes in Australia, who is mostly known for his oncology clinical trials, but for some strange reason got involved in a global network that we were developing on acute MI clinical trials. And John had sort of initially oriented me to the concept of publication bias, and then Kay's article, which I have cited probably hundreds of times in lectures about the equivalent of the dog ate my homework version of why clinical trials didn't get published, I think, had a huge impact on my thinking. So what then happened was, through a variety of circumstances, I ended up in a lot of discussions with Steve Nissen, who's sort of an adversary and colleague at the same time. We like to argue, and he had really been pushing the idea that ClinicalTrials.gov had to take over because of the problems that had occurred in the pharmaceutical industry. I started paying more attention to ClinicalTrials.gov, and the next thing I knew, they put me on the internal board of the Lister Hill Center, which is the board that oversees the internal research and development of the National Library of Medicine. So I really had a first-hand view of what was behind ClinicalTrials.gov and what was happening, and eventually came to believe that it was the only possible early-term solution to a problem that was bothering me a lot, which was that the clinical trials enterprise was becoming increasingly inefficient. And to those of us who sort of had a subjective view of it, increasingly incapable of providing the answers that were needed for practice. And yet, when you try to describe it, there was no description of the clinical trials enterprise that one could find. And so the idea that it had been required that you had to register most kinds of clinical trials in advance, initially with the journal editors and then with government law in the U.S., I saw as a great opportunity. So, let's see. There we go. So what I'm going to do is just give a little bit of my biased view about medical evidence and the role it ought to play in a scheme for doing it, and give you a little insight into why I got motivated in the first place. A few of the basics about ClinicalTrials.gov and our role in it, and then some just really fundamental, easy-to-digest findings that I think tell a story. And then a little bit about thinking for you all. I hope you do this. Put yourself in the shoes of a variety of different people who might want to use information to influence policy about what should be done with clinical trials. I should acknowledge my conflicts of interest here, which the slide I noticed wasn't there. You can go to the public website, dcri.org, and see all of my industry relationships kept up to date. But for this talk, you should know that we have a contract through the FDA with an organization called Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative that I'll talk about, which is one of the major projects in that contract is to try to develop data sets that can be publicly displayed and used by researchers to make more sense out of ClinicalTrials.gov. So this is my fundamental depiction of the way the world ought to work. I was spoiled early in my career because I started out running a coronary care unit just when we discovered that heart attacks were caused by blood clots, and we had these treatments that actually had an effect. And it just seemed natural that you would start with good basic science. And always, I don't know why, but just a rebel in me always has to say when I'm in a place like Hopkins or Duke, you notice that my diagram here has this little small box called Discovery Science. And then there's all these other big boxes all around it. That's my view of the world. I have to say I'm in the minority in academic medicine and medical schools about this depiction of the way the world ought to work. But it just seemed obvious that if you did the early translational steps correctly, and then you did the right clinical trials, and you had evidence that was clear, you could then develop guidelines that were instructive to patients and doctors and other people about what to do. And where it was really clear, you could measure performance. And then you could relate the performance to outcomes. And at the center of this, you notice, is not a view of human biology. It's a view of measurement and outcomes as the main knowledge tool for people who practice in the health professions, which is what I think it really should be. It's not to discount the value of biological understanding, but the concept that you know what treatment to use because you understand a biological mechanism really, I think, has been a major misfire in the medical education system. So it really worked this way in the field of ST elevation, myocardial infarction, and after that in non-ST elevation, acute coronary syndromes. And due to the influence of particularly the people in Oxford, it just became a routine that you would enter people into randomized clinical trials on a global basis and drive answers that were relatively definitive. And then out of hundreds of things that were tried, only a few things really were shown to work. And that you could add up the things that worked and measure whether people gave them. And that when you did that, there was a reduction in people's risk of being dead. It's just, seems obvious. So, the question I've had ever since is why doesn't every field do this as a matter of course? And of course, pediatric oncology has been doing this before cardiology thought of it. But for some strange reason, a lot of other people have not followed suit. And sort of the ultimate for me was to have validation from work of the group at Yale that during the course of my career, the risk of being dead if you make it into a hospital in a living state in North America has declined precipitously. And I would argue that, of course, without the new therapies, this would have never happened. But without the incorporation of evidence into practice as a routine, something expected of people who treat heart attacks and acute coronary syndromes, this would have taken 50 years to do instead of 10 to 20 years as it took to get this worked out. And I think incremental progress is still being made because of these expectations and because of this system. And so, armed with exuberance a few years back, we had this nice Italian fellow who came over to do some work with us, Pierluigi Tricosi, who's now in our faculty. And at the time, in our Centers for Education and Research and Therapeutics project with ARC, there was a lot of interest in clinical practice guidelines. And so I told Pierluigi, I've got this great project. We are the kings of evidence in cardiovascular medicine. We're going to be working with the ACC and the American Heart Association. We're just going to count in our clinical practice guidelines when we make a major recommendation, how often is a recommendation based on high quality evidence. You'll be famous because you'll show how great we are in cardiology. So we started doing it, and I think many of you are familiar. There are variations on the classification scheme, but the dominant one in cardiovascular medicine is Class 1 means in general you should do it, and Level A means that there's a high level of evidence. Class 3 means don't do it. 2A and 2B are in between. So the answer came in, and we thought there was a coding error in the computer, and it turns out about 15% of the time we have high quality evidence when we make our major recommendation, and there are whole fields with almost no evidence. And if we ask the other question, what about how often is it level of evidence C, which basically means people like me sitting in a room pontificating about what we believe, it's about half of the major clinical practice guidelines. There's a legitimate argument about whether you should even have a guideline under these circumstances. I actually believe you should if you label it correctly. I think it's better than nothing, but it's obviously far inferior to high quality evidence. And I don't have slides on this nor time to go into detail, but we have many examples now where when guidelines are made and they're followed, but they're not preceded by high quality evidence, what you really have is a machine that sometimes can actually lead to an increase in very bad things in a big population. And the classic example I would cite is high dose erythropoietin. If you haven't read the literature on that, it's highly worth reading, because in that case you had a single payer, you had dialysis units, you had dialysis providers, and you had companies that were selling erythropoietin with everyone believing it was better, but no randomized clinical trials done. And when the guidelines were made, incidentally funded by the companies directly, it was amazing adherence to the guidelines. But of course, everybody made money. The only problem was when we finally did the clinical trials, the answer was the opposite of what was being recommended. High dose erythropoietin was dangerous. So my conclusion then and my motivation for being so interested in this is that, I would argue we actually know what a learning health system looks like. It's been done in several fields, but we're falling so far short. And I should also mention, there's been sort of a bake-off of specialties now. I've challenged a lot of people. So far, we're the best. We are the best in cardiology. 15% is as good as it gets. The ID people looked at it was 13%. My brother's an orthopedic surgeon. They said they're not even going to bother to look because they know they're so far below that. So a reasonable person then might wonder if there's a way to measure progress towards a goal for better information from randomized trials in a system. So along comes ClinicalTrials.gov. You're all familiar with it, I think, but the origin of it, of course, was an effort by well-intended people to help desperate patients find clinical trials when they had a life-threatening condition. although a lot of people do look at the website, I would argue that's not been a particularly useful application. But fortunately, it got it started. And what happened then was that in 2004, largely due to the work of Kay and others, the journal editor said if you're going to publish a paper in a major journal, you've got to register your trial in this registry. And then Congress followed, largely, although you can't find this written anywhere, largely due to mistrust of industry and their academic collaborators, passed a law that said there's a legal requirement for registration for most types of trials that involve drugs, biologics, and devices that are relevant to United States practice. And then in a phased-in approach, which from my perspective, from the point of view of looking at sequential research issues, it's kind of nice because it's September of every year when these things come folded in. Results reporting was launched, and now adverse event reporting. It's important to know when you look at these data that there are exceptions. Interventional studies that are phase 1 are not required, although I've learned at Hopkins, just like at Duke, for most big academic centers to participate, we have a contractual requirement for agreement to register, and that there are a few other exceptions. And this has enabled us to see some amazing things already. First of all, I've changed my view from saying that not enough resources go into clinical trials to saying that too many resources go into stupid clinical trials. Because there are a lot of clinical trials being done. When you think about 330 per week being registered, imagine if all that energy were harnessed into answering important questions, what potentially could be done. So this is really a reiteration of other slides. It's worth noting that device trials do get some really special exemptions that may go away depending on legislation this year. So it seemed then evident that there's some other uses of ClinicalTrials.gov besides patients finding clinical trials to participate in. But the problem was that the system was devised for individuals to search for individual trials, not to aggregate data. And around about this time, being on the board at Lister Hill, we were seeing people like me were getting a lot of manuscripts to review from well-intentioned people who were trying to download aggregate data from ClinicalTrials.gov, not understanding what the issues were with the data. And there were some really bad decisions being made and things that were being submitted for publication. So there are multiple uses, and you could think about if you had a compendium of almost all the clinical trials being done, and now at least some element of the primary results of all the clinical trials getting done. So with a lot of, we had formed a public-private partnership with the FDA called CTTI, or Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative. It's a broader effort based on the idea that if we don't fix the clinical trial system, especially in the U.S., the FDA is going to get in more and more desperate shape because it has to make decisions based on either inferior data or data that has no U.S. representation, which we could argue about whether that matters, but I think most people feel it would be good if you're giving advice to 300 million people to at least have some element of the evidence base coming from the country in which the 300 million people reside. And so as part of CITI, we negotiated getting some money to create an aggregate analysis data set called AACT. And the concept is that this data set will be refreshed once a quarter to update the data into a set of files that a competent analyst could use. As I've learned, the definition of competent analyst is kind of interesting because it's hard for anybody except those with a fairly good level of technical competence to even use what we've put together. But it turns out, like a lot of things that happen with the U.S. Congress, my version of some of the issues that people complain about with ClinicalTrials.gov is basically what happens is nothing happens, then Congress gets inspired for some reason, usually having nothing to do with sort of an objective reality, and they pass a law, and the law has requirements, and then everybody has to scramble to make it happen. And in this case, there were timeline requirements for production of the interface and the data set that were really made it impossible to do the best job that you could. So developing an aggregate data set turns out, and I'm not intending to go through the details, but it's an imperfect art that involves a lot of informatics to come up with an analysis data set that's fully documented and annotated. One of the most important issues being that every time there's an update to what Congress wants or someone has a better idea, the definitions have changed. And I think there's something like 38 different definitions for data elements, which were documented but not in a place that was easy to access. And that was leading to a lot of problems because people didn't understand that downloading data today with the same variable name might give you a very different set of data than what you had from 8 years ago. So what do we see when we look at the aggregate data set now? We published this in JAMA in what was one of the more interesting experiences I've had trying to get a paper published. I suspect there were some people in the room who were reviewers, so I won't get into details about what I thought about it other than to say I probably went through more iterations of this manuscript than any that I've ever published, and I have over 1,000 manuscripts now, so that's saying a good bit. So what we see in this snapshot is that there are a lot of clinical trials, but of course, and this came up today in one of the discussions, what is a clinical trial? There's actually a definition in ClinicalTrials.gov, but particularly the academic people who enter data don't bother to read definitions very often. And so there are a lot of things that are clearly not clinical trials that are called clinical trials in the data set. So there was a lot of work to do with that. And we limited this look to things that had happened after 2007, because before then you have no idea at all what the universe of trials was, because people entered trials if they wanted to. There was no legal requirement to do it. So sure enough, when you look at funding source, the first thing was it was kind of surprising. And for example, one nuance in this data set is there's a variable called sponsor. Now, most people, when they hear sponsor, they think that means the entity that funded the clinical trial. But that's not what it means. What it means is the entity responsible for the conduct of the clinical trial and therefore responsible for reporting as a legal requirement to the data set. And so the sponsor and the funder can be two different things. So there's no way to directly get it, so we had to come up with an algorithm to try to estimate as best we could. But what was really shocking to a lot of people, but now is so obvious, and being at Hopkins, you really see it in full force, is that this category other. So first of all, people who think the NIH is funding most clinical trials directly, absolutely not. In terms of real, meaningful clinical trials, it's mostly industry. But there's this other category. What is that? And you see the funders by therapeutic area vary quite a bit. And you'll notice that my specialty is a little low on the NIH funded as a proportion of trials compared to oncology and mental health. And then you have a variety of intervention types, and because of the law, the suspicion is that behavioral studies, which are not required by law to be entered, are probably underrepresented. But regardless, you can see there's quite a spectrum of types. And then you say, gee, a person like me, I'm used to doing clinical trials with 5,000 to 20,000 participants, and I just assumed that was a large proportion of the clinical trials. When you look at the number of participants per clinical trial, you can see it's pretty rare to have more than 1,000. And the vast majority, the largest proportion, have 11 to 50 participants. I was shocked. But having heard, the story here and looking deeply into our own institution, of course, the story is these other clinical trials are mostly studies being done at academic medical centers, not directly sponsored by anybody, often an indirect sponsorship from NIH in a way that's part of a program project grant or some other element where you can't tie the clinical trial itself to a direct fund code by the NIH. And a fair number are investigator-initiated with no obvious funding source other than the institution in which the person works. And I thought, maybe this is just an artifact of the phase of the study, but even phase 3 trials, the median size is only 200. Now, where I come from, I can't even imagine that a 200-patient trial, except in very rare circumstances, would tell you about the risk-benefit balance of any treatment. I just can't imagine it. But apparently in a number of fields, people disagree with me. Then you look at location of sites and realizing that there's a World Health Organization registry also, and there's no obligation for people doing trials totally outside the U.S. to report their trials. There is a robust set of sites outside the U.S. that are participating, and you are able to detect a change which is in the direction that you would expect of a higher proportion of trials being done outside the U.S. Now, usually when I'm talking about this part of it, if it's inside the U.S., I keep having to point out to Americans that we're only 4% of the world's population. So if you thought, and I can say this now with a lot of confidence because we have a medical school in Singapore, so I can put on my Singaporean hat and say this is outrageous. How can the rest of the world let the U.S. do such a high proportion of the clinical trials? On the other hand, we have reason to be concerned that there is migration of trials from the U.S. purely because we're so incompetent in getting them done. And so my political view here is I'm a rabid advocate of globalization because I think in every culture you should do clinical trials that are pertinent to the medical practice patterns or the culture that you're in, whatever it may be. But outsourcing purely because of incompetence, I think, is a really bad thing. And I think that's really the issue in the United States. Well, then we get into this thing, which is the reason I stopped today and said, how do you define a clinical trial? Because I'd heard about this, but I didn't believe it was so profound. If you look at cancer clinical trials, the vast majority don't have masking, and there are arguments why that would be the case. But the vast majority are not randomized, and the vast majority have a single arm. Now, in cardiology, if you have a clinical trial with a single arm, we call that a registry, not a clinical trial. But in cancer, it's called a clinical trial. Now, can both be right? I think when you begin to look at this and dissect it apart, there are really strong arguments, and you should try getting a paper about this accepted in an oncology journal, by the way. There's strong arguments about why it may be different. I've been using my mother all day today in discussions, and I had my own experience with this. She's on her third chemotherapeutic agent for multiple myeloma, and miraculously, one of my former medical students is CEO of Onyx, which developed the latest new drug. And just as she became refractory to Velcade. So I called Tony Coles and I said, Tony, I want to get the latest from my mom. And he said, yeah, our drug just came on the market last week. I'll send you the manuscript. So it's an unpublished manuscript that's 200 patients with no comparator group. That's the evidence. Now, I got to say, for my mom, I thought that was just fine, better than nothing. I wish that a randomized trial had been done, but I was willing to accept it. So as I show these data, I obviously have a bias, but to me, the main issue is now that we can look at the portfolio, let's look at it across different entities, and let's have the discussions and the arguments about the right way to do trials. And then data monitoring committees. Of course, we have this thing where a lot of people didn't enter whether they had a data monitoring committee, but at least when you look at, and we're looking in much more detail now, it's hard to understand why some trials have data monitoring committees and others don't. It's not entirely clear. And this leads to a lot of interesting discussions now occurring about what should be the general criteria for having a data monitoring committee. So we had a little fun doing some multivariable analysis, and as you might expect, the NIH is pretty good about having data monitoring committees. We could have a long discussion about the way they do it in some institutes where the project officers get to see the unblinded data, but that's a sideline. But there are a lot of areas that have underrepresentation of data monitoring committees compared to others. And the question is, what's the rationale? Is it the correct thing to do? Now that we can track it in real time, might we intercept trials that don't have a data monitoring committee when they should? What about the use of randomization? And a lot of people said, well, in oncology, it's really just, phase 1 and 2 trials, because they do a lot more 1 and 2 trials. But the fact is, even adjusting for the phase of the trial and a lot of other factors, oncology is just less likely to randomize and less likely to blind. You'll notice it's really an outlier in terms of the use of blinding compared to other specialties. So what about particular applications then? So you begin to get a flavor that, what I believe is as we make the data more available, more people can look at it, easier to use. A lot of people legitimately can begin to think about their circumstance and their beliefs and begin to look at what other people are doing and ask questions. So what if you're an academic health system administrator like me? There are some questions you can ask, like number one for academic medical centers would be, is my institution compliant with the law? I don't know, Kay, does Hopkins register 100% of its trials? Don't know. That's the case in most academic centers. What I can tell you that's kind of interesting, there was a federal announcement made that, in fact, there is an enforcement capability of finding people who don't put their data correctly into ClinicalTrials.gov, and there's a plan to do it. Now, if you ask in order of sequence, who is most likely to be non-compliant with the law? Industry, the NIH itself, or academic centers? What would you guess? It's actually the NIH itself is the least compliant internally. And so I would love to see the federal government sue it or fine itself for lack of compliance with the law, but they probably won't do that. So it wouldn't surprise me if one of us gets picked on sometime in the near future for noncompliance with the law. And then if we succeed in making our software better and better, it should be an automated issue to be able to look at your own portfolio for the quality of the data, because there are edit checks that can help with that. Does the overall portfolio reflect what you think your priorities should be? Right now, in almost 100% of academic centers, no one can tell you how many trials of various types are being done, because system-wide databases really haven't been developed. But you can use ClinicalTrials.gov, put in your own institution, and you can pretty quickly figure that out. And then if you link the NIH grant portfolio with your publication portfolio, you can ask the question, how many of these things are getting published? I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a few minutes. And then I would think if you really want to do a good job, you'd want to ask the question, does my faculty have access to all the previous and ongoing trial information at the time when new studies are being planned? Because literally you can pretty much look at pretty much a complete portfolio of what's currently being done if you have the right software. What if you're an NIH Institute director? This was a lot of fun for me because I like to provoke people even when I'm wrong. And it turned out that none of the NIH Institute directors could actually sort of put their fingers on the portfolio of trials that were being funded by their institutes. And there are reasons that this has happened, which I think are a little sinister, because the NIH itself, as a matter of policy, I don't believe wanted the public to be able to look carefully at segments of things that were being funded, because it would lead to a lot of interesting policy debates. But it can now be done, and I'm going to show you the result of that with regard to one of the institutes. And so an institute director or staff might say, is my institute and its grant recipients compliant? That might be something that you wouldn't want to be the institute whose grantees were the ones who got fined for noncompliance. And is our portfolio consistent with our priorities? And what about my institute versus industry? If industry is funding a trial that you're looking at rather than take it by word of mouth, you can look pretty directly now and see the other trials that are being done in various areas. So you're probably all familiar with this controversial paper that came out from Joe Ross and Harlan Krumholtz, taking interventional clinical trials and coning down on the NIH-funded clinical trials. And so the initial bottom line was a third of them weren't published at all. And they did some nice calculations of how long does it take to get them published. And you'll notice that the cumulative distribution plot stops at 70%, which is just, again, telling you that a lot don't get published at all. But look how long it takes to get them published after completion of the study. And then they asked the question, is it getting better over time? And in fact, it does look like it's getting a bit better over time. But initially, the reaction at the NIH was sort of incredulous. You're telling me that the NIH-funded studies by our great academic centers are not getting published? Because most of us thought this is an industry problem. This is not an academic center problem. And to its credit, after some gnashing of teeth, the NIH has been looking pretty carefully at this. And with permission, I'm going to show work led by Mike Lauer about the institute. I mostly get funded by the NHL VI. And they've taken this very seriously. There's a publication which I understand is in press now about this. So stimulated by this paper from Joe Ross and others, they said, let's look at all of our extramural cardiovascular trials and look at time to publication, and then look at a number of predictors of time to publication. And the first thing that popped out is if the trial's measuring a real clinical endpoint, almost 100% are published, and they get done reasonably quickly. If it's measuring other endpoints, it takes a long time and has a significant probability of not being published at all. And then this slide's a little difficult, so I'm just going to describe it, but I'm still trying to figure out exactly what to conclude from this slide. But if you look at the plot with budget on one axis and likelihood of being published on the other, and then divided by clinical endpoint studies and non-clinical endpoint studies, what you see is a replication of the previous slide. Clinical endpoint studies, almost all of them are published. Non-clinical endpoint studies, they're not all published. But it turns out that the budget of the trial is another huge factor. So there are only two things that really popped out. Is it measuring clinical endpoints? And it looked like the break point is it funded to over $5 million? I don't know exactly what that means, that it has to be over $5 million, but you might have some ideas about that. And then he put trials into three groups. The green here represents non-clinical endpoint trials under $5 million. The blue represents clinical endpoint trials over $5 million, and the red are the two categories in between. And he looked at citations. And basically the message was, if you did a little tiny study that had a non-clinical endpoint, it was highly unlikely you would ever be cited, and if you were, the trail of citations was pretty short. So where if you did clinical endpoint trials that were bigger, it had a big impact. So these are Mike's conclusions, that using different methods, he's basically replicated Joe Ross's findings in a single institute, and that if you really want to get messages to the public about health, you should do trials that are substantial enough that they're measuring things that matter, and then they're accepted. Now, there was one moment, and I only know about this secondhand, and I'm probably misquoting it, but apparently there was a congressional committee with somebody at the NIH where the congressman said, why are we putting public money into these human experiments that are not being published? And the answer was, well, we're publishing all the important studies. So the next question was, why are we putting public money into unimportant studies that are not worth being published? And so there's a real policy question here that everybody's going to have to grapple with. There are, of course, 1,000 reasons why small unpublished studies in academic centers would be useful for a lot of things. But I would submit to you that if you begin to take an assay of the studies done at Hopkins or at Duke or anywhere in the U.S. that are in this category of small studies with non-clinical endpoints, and you subjected it to the question, is it worth the resource in aggregate to put all this money into those kind of trials, you would probably conclude that you could save a lot of money or put it into more important questions by being more rigorous in the evaluation of what you go forward with. And I think NHLBI is now trying to figure out what to do with this. And you can imagine it'll be quite a discussion with the grantees. But the other sort of thing which I knew, but I thought was interesting, what if you're an FDA division director? You basically, in the FDA, you deal with the data that's brought to you by someone who wants to make a claim. So you now have the ability to look at all the trials, at least that are registered, that deal with the area of interest for your part of the FDA. And you can look at trials and products that may be related to the one that you're evaluating, but may be a little different, or may even be the same product but called a different name with a different company somewhere else. And you can begin to ask the question about where are the gaps in knowledge about these products. So I'm going to just show you a little bit that we've been doing with oncology. Some of our people, together with David Diltz, who's a well-known critic of the clinical trial system, but with the support of the NCI. So if you look at oncology trials, you can sort them out. As you might imagine, there are a lot of decisions you make in the informatics of this. So is a trial of cardiovascular toxicity of a chemotherapeutic agent an oncology trial or a cardiology trial? So there are arbitrary decisions along the way that one must make. But if you look at the portfolio, it just replicates what we've shown before. Oncology is different than the other specialties. And it's different in very important ways that are typically considered markers of high-quality clinical trials. Now, the oncologists generally believe that actually they're doing better trials, and there are good reasons why they're different. My view of that is that oncology is doing it a better way. It would sure be a lot easier if we could do single-arm trials in cardiology. We get a lot of trials done. But I'm not sure that I agree with that. It's a good topic for debate. It is true that oncology does a lot more early-phase trials. And if you look at oncology trials as a function of the type of cancer, big differences in survival, but the attributes of the oncology trials look about the same across types of cancer. And so this is sort of like work we're doing with disparities, where you see that the neighborhoods people live in are more important than almost anything else. It looks like oncologists sort of run as a herd. So there's a belief set about how trials should be done in oncology that's different than other specialties. What if you plot trials by cancer type against the incidence of cancer? The good news, I think, for general and public policy is there is a significant relationship here. One could argue about prostate and lung cancer, or on the other hand, other trials that are a little off the mark. And I don't think anyone would argue that in public policy you should have something that's exactly on the regression line. But I would argue that if you were a patient advocate for one of these diseases, you should be entitled to see what industry and the government are doing in terms of which trials they're funding, and you should be able to ask questions about why that's the case. So here's a look at mortality and trial portfolio. And basically, if you look at the whole thing, you can see lung is off the mark. And it's probably the case that there should be more trials in lung cancer. It's a rapidly advancing cause of death. If you take out lung cancer, everything else is a little closer to the mark. So if I was an advocate for lung cancer patients, I would be on Capitol Hill today showing these slides saying, wait a minute, guys, there's got to be something done about this. So a bunch of our fellows got together in a think tank and said, what are solutions to the issues that we're seeing in the data? The number one issue, which many people have complained about, is that ClinicalTrials.gov is not perfect. And it's way far from perfect. There are a lot of issues with it. And so we feel that there needs to be a constant effort to improve the data. But our argument right now, since many things in ClinicalTrials.gov are mandated by law, and trying to get Congress to pass a law hasn't been the easiest thing lately. Our argument is that if we make the data more accessible publicly, the advocates will make sure the data is cleaned up. Because how would you like it if you were a juvenile rheumatoid arthritis advocate and you got something in the mail that said, look, your investigators are not putting their data into ClinicalTrials.gov correctly. I think the best way to clean up data, much like financial data in an academic system, first time you look at it, it's terrible, no one believes it. But then if you use it, it gets better and better over time. We hope that we'll be in this quarterly update and that we'll make it easier for people to get their hands on the data as we move along. This has taken more work, as usual, than I thought it would. And in addition to that, since we've never been able to look at the portfolio, the question of how would you optimize research design in a portfolio of trials is an unanswered question. Now, in business schools, there are entire experts in how to optimize portfolios of factories or hospitals or other such entities. It's never been done for clinical trials, and I think it's a really interesting question. And then there's no mechanism to guide funding. I had a fascinating meeting with the National Breast Cancer Coalition. One of the fun things about the meeting was to go to my lecture, you had to pass a test showing that you had proficiency in the fundamentals of clinical trials. So I was in a room with a group of real experts who were lay advocates, and I showed them the data about types of cancer. And my question was, given the fact that breast cancer is overrepresented relative to mortality rates or incidence rates, shouldn't you be advocating for other types of cancer? The general view, which I think they had practiced because they probably knew I was going to ask it, was no, we do things right. The other groups just need to get their act together and come in and advocate the way they should for their types of cancer. But make no mistake about it, advocacy has a huge impact on what gets funded, and it's a very big factor. One other thing just to show you that's more sort of a fun thing about the culture of clinical trials, and we're doing a lot of ongoing work with this. If you look at sites that do clinical trials, and you want to talk about a mess, try to define what a research site is. Duke University Health System is represented by 1,300 different research sites. I think Hopkins is probably at least twice that big. Every little clinic. Dan Ford told me last night that in one clinical trial, your ophthalmology center has 2 different research sites for the same trial. And it makes it sort of hard to aggregate, but it's best we can do it when you start looking at who likes who in the clinical trials industry. It turns out that, at least in cancer, different types of cancer have very different social norms. So what we've seen is that the general design features are the same, but who works with who is quite different in different types of cancer, and it looks stable over time. So you might ask the question, what is the optimal configuration of doing clinical trials if the public good was what you had in mind? If you're a prostate doctor, there are a couple of centers, and I think Hopkins is maybe one of them, that seem to just dominate everybody else. But if you're in some other areas, it's much more dispersed in terms of how the sites are connected to coordinating centers and to each other in terms of doing common trials. Or you might look at it by who has access to participate in clinical trials by the incidence of cancer in different areas. And, this can be done in a much more refined way. Not a surprise, probably, that there's not exactly equal access depending on where you live in the United States. And it's interesting that you'll notice yourselves here that the big cancer centers really dominate, and it might be a fair question, would it be better to have a different system that enrolled a more representative sample of people who couldn't necessarily fly to MD Anderson or Johns Hopkins? And just things to think about. So many of us who do clinical trials have been subjected to the belief that it's so hard to do clinical trials and it's so expensive, we ought to just reserve clinical trials for the few things that are really critically important, and everything else is obvious from observational analysis. My view of it now is the opposite, because if you took the energy that you can see sitting in ClinicalTrials.gov and focus it on clinical trials that made a difference, and you take advantage of what's happening with regard to information systems, we can fix the problem. So the last few minutes, I just want to quickly go over. I mentioned this morning in the other lecture, so it may be repetitive for those of you who could stand 2 of my lectures in one day. But this is 2002. This is the NIH roadmap from your former faculty member, Elias Sarhouni. Many of us met, and when we talked about the clinical research enterprise, one axis is degree of difficulty and the other is time. So we're 10 years out, so we're at the end of the span now. And so upper right-hand corner is most difficult in 10 years. And what was envisioned was a national clinical research system based on everyone having electronic health records, and the concept that patients, their families, and providers would work together to design clinical trials and do them very quickly, repetitively, with dissemination back through the electronic health records. And so here we are today, and I would argue there is absolutely no technological barrier to this being the system today. It's all a matter of the cultures that we have. So we were right in terms of technology. We missed it in terms of culture. And so just to show you the power of the technology, we now have 130 million electronic records in a system called the Sentinel system that was mandated by the FDA. We've worked out ways to get around some of the culture by creating technological fixes to allow people to hold on to their data without having to give it up, but to share the answers from the data. And we're beginning to think now about how to include randomization into large aggregate electronic health record systems. In addition to that, many specialties driven by payers who want to know that you're providing high quality are being mandated to collect high quality data. I was initially exposed to this because the Society of Thoracic Surgeons really developed their database as a defensive maneuver over a decade ago, because states were requiring that there be data about surgical quality in order to get paid. And we've been the data coordinating center for the STS for a long time, and it's increasingly an optimal system to do a clinical trial, because you can do the trial, you know who got put in and who didn't out of the entire universe, and after the trial's over, you can see who got the therapy and who didn't in practice. But this is becoming something that's going to be possible in more places. So the final slide. I hope we're now beginning to enter the era with regard to the world of clinical trials where we're not all looking at one part of what's out there, but now we can see close to the whole elephant in ClinicalTrials.gov. And as we add on connected systems to the aggregate database, whether it's through the World Health Organization globally, or it's through NIH systems or other systems, that will increasingly be able to examine the portfolio and have much smarter policies about what's done, how it's done, eradicate stupid trials that aren't going to make a difference, and focus on trials that really matter to patients and providers. So thanks for your attention. I hope this has given you a little bit to think about.
Any questions for Dr. Califf?
Yes.
Not questions, but I have 2 comments. One regarding the number of trials in lung cancer. And I think some of that is motivated by biases towards people with lung cancer, but I think it's also because it's felt that it's largely preventable, and there's a lot of money that goes into prevention rather than in the clinical trials, and that may be part of that imbalance with lung cancer. And I spent several years working with the CNS Consortium doing phase 1 and 2 clinical trials, and at the time most of those were unrandomized, and the idea was that survival in that patient group at the time was 12 months or less, so there wasn't a big need to then do the randomized trial when you're checking out doses and looking for preliminary signs of efficacy, and their goal was to try to get, test as many drugs as possible with the limited number of patients that actually get glioblastoma. So I think after that they did start pushing, NIH started pushing for randomized trials even in their phase 2, but for a while it wasn't the goal.
Yeah, so thanks for those comments. And please understand, I realize I could be completely wrong about anything I say. There's nothing I like better than being proven wrong. But what I'd say, I think the question of whether one should be biased against a patient with lung cancer because it may be preventable is a fair question for advocates for lung cancer research to argue about. And I think arming people with real data as opposed to opinions, the answer may be it's the right thing to do, and that's okay with me, but I'd like for people to be able to have the discussion armed with data, which is now possible. With regard to the second question, we have one of the big glioblastoma centers too, and I've actually been spending a lot of time on this, and I'll say two things about it. Number one, there's another disease called acute heart failure where the survival time is not much different. And it was said that you couldn't do randomized trials there because these people were so sick, and in fact a number of drugs got through the FDA without randomized trials. But we've now shown you can do randomized trials, and you get much clearer answers when you do that benefit a lot more people. And the second thing I'll say is that, and I'm not saying this is happening, but I have a suspicion that when there's a lot of money to be made on chemotherapy and you have desperate people, sometimes excuses get made for not doing the right studies. And I can say this because we have one of the big centers. Maybe if you're a place that gets those referrals that make a lot of money, you're not really interested in collaborating with your other friends who see glioblastoma patients because that would change the referral pattern. So the strange thing to me about that field is why there's so few multi-center trials. And what I learned from the pharmaceutical industry is that they like to give the drugs to the people dealing with glioblastoma because loyalties get built that way, and it's not necessarily the science that's driving it. Again, I could be totally wrong about this, but again, I think this can be dealt by showing glioblastoma compared to other diseases and let people have at it about their policies. Yes?
Two comments back to what you said. Part of the problem, it seems to me, with ClinicalTrials.gov is the definitions are not very crisp. So you deal with interventional study, and as you alluded to, well, that covers a whole bunch of things. So it's not, they're not very crisp. The second comment, I guess, is that the interface for trying to update or trying to register is not terribly user-friendly. I'm in a situation with a study that was ultimately registered by people at the NIH, and of course the regulations have changed. I spent 3 years trying to figure out how to update it and still can't get it done because you can't figure out who you need to talk to get it done. So, there's some streamlining that's necessary there.
I don't know if you've heard Deborah Zarin's lecture on ClinicalTrials.gov entries that they see, and I do not disagree with you. Changing it is complicated for a lot of reasons. I think industry has figured this out. And what happens in industry is they now have people that enter the data, and they have, the big companies especially have requirements that the statisticians, for example, that worked on the trial oversee that data entry. So it's very efficient, pretty high quality, and it gets done. So the question would be, at a place like Hopkins or Duke, at an institution, you guys have $9.5 billion in revenue, I think I saw now, for your entire system. We're at about $3.5 billion. Surely we could afford to have a couple of people who are expert in entering across a portfolio of what we do and put it in there. Admittedly, I mean, if we were in a different world, you would just fix the definitions, you would fix make a nice user interface. But it turns out that's, for a lot of reasons that are arcane and have to do with government issues, it's hard to do. Yes?
Dr. Califf, you have called our attention to the fact that a sizable number of clinical trials are never published. I'm wondering if one presumes that a high fraction of those might be negative trials, but would one potential solution to this problem be to legally mandate that the results from all trials be actually reported on ClinicalTrials.gov as a secondary source, that at least allow individuals to find negative trials?
You're brilliant. And in fact, that's been done. So it is a legal requirement now, and anyone who's not doing it within 1 year of the last endpoint is breaking the law, and you could be subject to a fine by the U.S. government for not doing it. The problem, of course, is that having a single format for entering all clinical trials results is pretty tough, and there are many arguments and discussions that go on, because if you think registering your trial is hard, putting results in is tough. But I got to tell you, because I spend a lot of time with the folks in LM, you just wouldn't believe some of the things that we see from people that say they have done a human experiment and they're trying to enter their data, and they have no earthly idea even what a result is, and had no hypothesis or any way of framing what a primary endpoint would be. I think the record right now is there's one trial that had 120 primary endpoints. So, I think a lot of the solution to the problem is people like us calling something what it is. I think a lot of these is not that they're negative, it's that they had no possibility of showing a meaningful result. And so you got to ask the question, why would you start a human experiment that had no possibility of showing a meaningful result? Well, there's some reasons that are given, like we got trainees, they have to learn how to start doing it at all. But there's a robust argument about should the trainees be participating in trials to get meaningful results as team members, as opposed to doing their own little tiny project that can't get a result. So thanks for that. Yes?
Yeah, a very interesting talk. Yesterday you said you're working on your CTSA application for the input process. And as I was listening to your talk today, I must say, do you think the CTSAs are helping us, or are they really embedding the status quo? My own experience was that they try to spread the resources as broadly as possible, and therefore encouraging small studies.
Well, just to be fully revealing conflicts in my answer to this question, like you, we didn't get our CTSA funded. And so, of course, I think the CTSAs were going in the wrong direction. The good news there is that there's now a thing called CTSA 2.0. And I would urge you to go to the slide set from the first council meeting of NCATS. There's one slide that lists the 5 priorities for CTSA 2.0. And I can tell you from having been in, because of this other project I talked about this morning, the collaboratory, I've been spending a lot of time with the same people. And there's a real desire on the part of NIH leadership to change the clinical trials system to something that is more likely to produce meaningful results. That's actually listed as the first priority. And in fact, one of the reasons that the changes were made in the location of CTSAs, from my understanding, is if you ask the institute directors, did the CTSAs help you get your research done, they felt almost uniformly the answer was no. And that's a pretty good measure of whether you're serving a useful purpose. So I think it's a fixable problem. We all have our own opinions, and we'll see when the reviews get done how we come out this time. Yes, Al.
Rob, great talk as always, and provocative. So there's the new kid in town is Pecori, and their reputation is thus far relatively unsullied with regard to clinical trials. They are interested in different kinds of trials, effectiveness trials and so forth. What advice do you have for them related to your trials?
Well, I'm delighted to say that I've been talking with Joe Selby lately, and that he's become a real advocate for randomized clinical trials, which he wasn't earlier because of the job he was in at Kaiser was a different kind of a job. And I think they're on the right track. And, you know, it was hard to even talk about this before the election because part of the Republican platform was to do away with patient-centered research, which I thought was fascinating as a strategy. But I think the concept of having patients involved in designing trials, as I said this morning, is the right way to do it. And I'm sure that when and I think they are going to fund clinical trials. I know from what he's told me that they're looking for ways that they can link with others funding clinical trials so they're not having to pay for all of the startup costs. So there's a real synergy that could evolve between the NIH and PCORI in terms of a common infrastructure. That's what I hope will happen. But for that to work, it means that places like Hopkins and Duke and all of our affiliated institutions have to say, you know, it's really good to have people that invent the clinical trial, but if we don't have people that get rewarded for entering people in clinical trials, they're not going to get done. And that's really the nugget of what I think has to change. If you punish people for taking the time to get consent and deal with clinical trials, and you only reward the people that submitted the application and got the funding, you're going to get a reproducible result, which is what the NIH has right now. At the American Heart Association, we were all talking about the fact you shouldn't use the word NIH funded and underpowered in the same sentence because it's redundant. There's no reason to do that. Yes.
Going back to clinical trials, who owns the data? To what extent, when it chose to do the same analysis of the study, which are the owners of the current study being done?
One of the fun things about the last 2 days is we've had a lot of discussions about liberating data and who owns it and all that. And, you know, the good news on ClinicalTrials.gov, at least for what's there, it's public. The public owns it. And so if you can figure out how to download the data, you can do whatever you want to do with it. No one controls that. This is getting really interesting now that results reporting is moving along and now that adverse event reporting is moving along. I've got to tell you, I actually tried really hard to stop the adverse events from being reported because unsophisticated people that look at raw adverse events in a table without knowing what the impact of patient selection and control group is on those numbers could draw some bad conclusions. And it could be an inciting factor for what already happens with industry often, which is studies are designed to minimize the number of adverse events that occur as opposed to trying to get the truth about what would happen in practice. But having said that, it's public data. You can go on the website and do anything you want to with it. And it's your right as a taxpayer having funded this. I hope that more data gets added to it. And we also discussed the fact that right now the EMA in Europe has said they're going to make all the data publicly accessible from applications to the EMA. So that may move the U.S. along a little bit faster. Okay, well, thanks, everybody.